Thank you, Mike. And also a big call out to you and your team for continuing to unite this industry together. And the last session really teed up this session perfectly well. We have 20 minutes, so it's a super fast 20 minutes. And we have some conversation going in the Slack. So please answer some of the questions that I laid out there. As Mike said, I'm the president and co-founder of PackView. We're a marketing automation platform uniting advertising efficiencies across Amazon, Walmart, Instacart, and more to come this year. And we're really thrilled to be partnering with Profitero to provide actions to all this great data that we have in e-commerce. All right, so I'm gonna kick it off to our presentation today. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And I'd say that well characterizes the rise of e-commerce that we saw this year that has many ramifications and throws quite a wrench into the planning process. We went from shopping looking like this to this overnight. And as we head into the holiday season, it's going to look very different as the majority of US shoppers will turn to digital. This year, most retail stores will be closed on Thanksgiving, and in-store Black Friday deals will kick off somewhere, will be pushed online. Amazon's Prime Day will probably kick off sometime in October, is what we're being told, and will likely initiate the start of holiday deals that will run for months, not the normal 5 days. And for those of us who are sitting here and last year we're looking at annual planning, it's looking really different this year and has caused brands to be both nimble and reactive. Being nimble has always been challenging for enterprise brands, and as e-commerce leaders and leaders of change, we often point to smaller, more agile brands as examples to encourage this behavior that's more conducive to taking advantage of opportunities or react faster to things that are happening in the environment. So the question is, how have enterprise brands been able to change their corporate cultures and pivot during this time, and how is it going to change moving forward? We just heard that in the last session, that is something people are really thinking about. So to kick off this conversation, Laura, as the leader of e-commerce at Henkel, can you tell us a little bit about how you reacted to COVID as an example of this more nimble behavior?
Yeah, look, for large CPGs, Melissa, you said it right. Nimble's not really usually our middle name. But this year, for many of us, we were really forced to be nimble because we had to be. And it was, we actually learned that we could be. I think you heard that on the last panel. I mean, you got Jason from Mattel, and they just completely almost blew up their plan and redid it. So, learning that lesson of, wow, we really can do this if we have to do it, was probably the greatest lesson of all. And so, I'm probably echoing things that almost all the major brands and even smaller brands did, right? We did feel a lot of out of stock challenges. We're part of the essentials category. So whether you're a consumer or a supplier, you felt the out of stock pain. And so this did lead us, especially during that heightened panic mode, to really transition our spend from demand driving activities more towards conversion driving activities. And one way we did that was shifting budget into e-retailer search. It wasn't the only thing we did, but that was obviously something that we did because we wanted to be obviously found in that moment where we could make it into those first online baskets, because I think a number of people have mentioned today, right? There's all these new consumers going online, and getting in that first basket was really critical. And then finally, it was also about really moving as fast as we could with the shoppers who really moved online in droves. And we did do this broadly. There are a number of really important platforms out there, Amazon, Walmart, Target, for example, perhaps even if you have your own D2C platform. But one player really kind of rose from from being nascent to a much bigger player, and that was Instacart. So I'm going to talk about them just as an example, because here, we had all these obvious players that we already had plans against, and maybe we had to shift some budget there. But then we had some examples like Instacart, where, overnight we basically had a new, sort of new platform to fund, certainly at a level that we certainly had not planned for. And it was also a new platform for a lot of our marketing teams who hold the purse strings, right? So, and then when they opened up their platform to self-service search in Q2, it just became this huge opportunity, and they really exploded and became, they obviously had the most to gain from a smaller base. And they certainly were not the only winner. Certainly, they're not the only winner. They did grow the most in the pandemic, and they do have really broad reach. And they've shown that their shoppers are probably going to stick around. But I want to highlight them mainly because they really are this perfect example of this just incredibly volatile and dynamic market that we're all working in. And the thing is that they even keep growing. So they've announced partnerships now with Walmart. They announced a partnership last week with 7-Eleven. So it's not even just about the stock up trip. It's also about, a little bit, closer to immediate consumption trips. So really attractive for a lot of different suppliers. So the point here is not to go on and on about Instacart, but really to use this as an example to think about in years coming, who, we might just not even know who those accelerating players might be, right? They could be a more traditional retailer that turns something on, launches a new platform, goes gangbusters, makes an acquisition that's really big. They could be a new, sort of growing delivery intermediaries like an Uber, Postmates, or Shipt. Or they could even be a player that we don't even know about today, right? Whether that's next year or in the years to come. And we can't control the timing of when these guys take off. So it really this year reinforced that need to, okay, this year we were able to pivot and be nimble because we had to, but we can't go back to planning the old way. And so how do we build in, more fluidity as we move into future years?
Awesome, thanks. So we're going to do a case study. Mindy's going to take us through why the speed to market kind of really matters.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So we'd like to highlight a brand that was able to be agile early on when COVID first hit. And in case Laura's legal team is lurking on the line, this is not a Henkel brand. Neither of these brands are Henkel. These are actually two brands in a highly concentrated category that have relatively low e-commerce penetration relative to the rest of the product categories. So definitely not an e-com first mentality within these two brands. However, pre-COVID, given the concentration in this category, these brands actually captured combined 58% share of voice for the top tracked keywords in this category. So, very concentrated across these two brands being the top two players, with the remainder being a number of 3P insurgent brands. So brand one was able to react very quickly and shift dollars where the consumers were shopping in kind of early to mid-March. Where brand two, they set budgets annually, and historically they've been less nimble and slow to pivot. So the net result is that brand one gained total share of voice, and by total, I mean paid plus organic, total share of voice of 1,000 basis points from their pre-COVID levels to now. They've been able to sustain those gains. Brand two did gain 400 basis points of total share of voice. However, as a net result, brand one did gain and sustain 600 basis points total share of voice over their key competitor in the category. It's also important to note that by investing in paid search pretty heavily, brand one was also able to gain over 600 basis points of organic share of voice. So long-term, paid share of voice investments do drive organic ranking. And now post-COVID, both brands combined have captured over 72% share of voice in the category. So in terms of first movers and the advantages of being a first mover, there's several short and long-term advantages to be gained as a first mover. One, obviously, is being able to learn ahead of the competition and gain that competitive edge. Also, new platforms tend to deliver cheap clicks in the early days. So brands who invest early are able to gain share of voice early on with very little investment. In CPG categories and on Instacart in particular, driving early conversion likely leads to repeat purchases over time, specifically on Instacart, where consumers start shopping from their previous shopping list more and more as they continue to shop on the platform. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, with e-commerce platforms being algorithmically driven, early adoption of paid search can really drive long-term organic relevancy. Here's another example of a first mover case study. This one is on Walmart. So if you guys remember, Walmart announced their launch of a self-service paid search platform in early January. One of PacView's consumer electronics clients became an early adopter, and in early March, they started investing in Walmart. So when tracking the top 10 keywords for the category in which they play, what they saw was on Amazon, they had significant competition. So they were one of 84 advertisers where no one advertiser held more than 10% share of voice. However, on Walmart, they launched on Walmart in early March where they had only one key competitor and they were able to own 90% share of voice with very minimal investment. And then again, in terms of early expertise that can be gained as an early adopter, as new platforms have launched, PacView has been able to gain some early insights, through the lens of our clients. So particularly on Walmart and really even on Instacart, where, it's more of a grocery store like format and consumers are more likely to purchase those lower ASP items. Specifically on Walmart, we tend to see, even when you have a broad range of price points in your selection, the consumer really tends to gravitate toward those lower ASP items, and those tend to see higher conversion. So given the retailer and brand profitability challenges that low ASP items sold online pose, it's really important across platforms, all platforms really, to leverage a paid search strategy that drives basket building and also mix to higher ASP items. For example, larger pack sizes, or even on Instacart, targeting your search towards some of the club SKUs. And then lastly, we've seen brands have some success, particularly with Instacart, and unlocking additional brand investment, just given that Instacart is retailer agnostic. And so brands aren't having to leverage trade funds.
Awesome. So one of the things that you need to be an early mover is the ability to get newer incremental budgets. And often that's one of the big obstacles we face, kind of like these buffaloes standing in the middle of the road. We bring up Instacart in this presentation because it's an example of a new opportunity that presented itself off a planning cycle and a trend worthy of investment. So the question is, how do you get those dollars like Laura was able to do early to be able to prove out something without being able to guess that it's going to be there? So some things that we heard in the last session that people were talking about too was this concept around budget fluidity. And the way that we define this is the ability to move budget flexibly and quickly without layers of decision makers across platforms, channels, and retailers based on just-in-time information. And many of us know John Denny. He's a marketing mastermind that really helped create the Buy brand that sold to Dr. Pepper. And he often talks about, his experience there that I wanted to bring to life here in this presentation, where he really looked at his budget very fluidly. He was a single-threaded owner of media, which is exactly what Holly talked about in the last section, where she talked about the fact that she was able to own the media and the decisions. And he would look across his digital platforms and channels, and he'd be able to make fast decisions and move money around based on performance and KPIs. And he often says, you need to be able to call an audible at the line of scrimmage. So if something is performing well, he had the autonomy to be both reactive and proactive. And so that example I mentioned is probably far from reality at most kind of enterprise brands. And there's a lot of challenges in the way that kind of go against this concept of budget fluidity. And some of these things are the fact that there are retailer expectations and commitments. And obviously that's not something that we can completely yank or take away at all, and not a desire either. This concept around single-threaded ownership, and that I think is really critical to be able to make these decisions. So the more that one person at least can have purview and see and be able to be empowered to make the decisions. Of course, there's risk and domain knowledge, and then comparable access, data access. That's something that we're really committed at PacView to help solve, where we're bringing retailer platforms together and being able to compare apples to apples to KPIs so that we can make these decisions across retailer platforms and at least understand the data in a comparable way. And then I'm going to tee up the next slide that Mindy is going to talk about, which is this concept around static planning cycles. And that's something that hopefully we can help overcome or start the conversation around, which is teeing up for Mindy to talk about the Amazon annual planning cycle as an example.
Yeah, so obviously full budget fluidity is not going to happen overnight, right? And as Laura describes it, it's really more of a North Star for brands to start working toward. But obviously it is important to start working toward it to mitigate risk, right? So given the ever-changing retail landscape, brands should really consider revamping their annual planning cycles to do a bottoms-up forecast more than once a year. I know most people on the line that work for brands are probably not loving that suggestion. However, I think COVID has proven why, some kind of at least lightweight process to revisit your bottoms-up forecast is really important to do more than once a year. So take Amazon, for example. Amazon actually does 3 bottoms-up forecasts per year. So in Q4 of the prior year, they do OP1, which is Operating Plan 1, where they forecast the whole following year. Well, then in February, once they have Q4 of the prior year actualized, they revisit their annual plan with a focus on Q4. And then again, in July of that year, they revisit their bottoms-up plan again, which they call Current Estimate 3, again with a heavy focus on Q4, just given the height of the sales period there. And then they do monthly R&Os in between at a pretty detailed level. So Laura, while brands are unlikely to mirror Amazon's process, do you agree that there may be opportunity to enhance current forecasting processes to achieve a bit more budget fluidity?
Yeah, for sure. Look, we certainly do sales forecasts all the time, but when it comes to our marketing and media budget and media plan, we're probably not looking at it as often as we could or thinking about changing it, right? So we proved this year that we can do it, that we can completely shift and pivot and move into new platforms and put the money where it's working harder for us. So we have been talking about, okay, there's pieces of our budget that are a lot more difficult that we, whether it's upfront commitments or JVP commitments, those types of things. But then where are there places in our budget where we can build in more fluidity and perhaps even build in a sort of more frequent sort of checkpoint structure like digital media, social media, paid social, paid search, and e-retailer search. So, it's also about even talking about getting a more fluid mindset so that when you sit down with your brands in March and say, hey, actually, we had this, we had planned to take the budget you gave me and plan it, spend it this way, but we want to spend it a completely different way. There's also sort of a mindset piece. So when we thought about Mindy and Melissa and I sort of sat down and thought about, what are some more ways that we can build in budget fluidity, there's a lot of different things that we can be thinking about. So, obviously, sometimes it takes having some great, what I call sort of advocates and champions that you find along the way. They don't have to be executive level. I think it works actually great if you can find some just business partners and brand partners who are willing to sort of jump in this sort of more fluid ride with you through the year, right? And then Jason actually mentioned it in the last session from Mattel, integrating your disparate teams a little bit more closely, right? Your retail teams with your shopper marketing team, with your brand team, with your media team, and making sure that you're really bringing the right people together and thinking about the plans more holistically and sort of agnostically. And in order to do that, right, you need to be able to measure and monitor the right KPIs and have what Melissa was talking about. It helps as the data and as the platforms become more sophisticated, that you are able to do more comparisons, comparable KPIs across platforms, so you can see, oh, these funds are working harder for me, or I need these funds for this, or oh my gosh, I've got a new player. How can I still fund them and still drive the sales that I've committed to? Some other things that we have on this list, right, are things around like holding back funds, identifying some investment funds that you can use throughout the year for test and learn, making sure that you actually do set aside that, right, and have a learning plan, for example. And then, we talked about the being agnostic, right? Setting that holistic strategy across platforms. We heard that a lot in the last session. And Holly did make that great point of, because she has all media under her, she can kind of move things around, and also just making sure that you're putting all those things in the bucket. So there's a lot of sort of small ways that the teams can come together to achieve, let's call it, more fluidity in 2021 planning and beyond. I know that we are going to make an effort at Hinkle in the coming year to be more prepared to really change that play call at the last minute if some new player arises or the market shifts or we need to move. And we're starting to already talk about that. Like how do we build in more checkpoints, more planning cycles? And so, I just think it's only going to become more. We're going to need to do this much more. But the good news is I think the data and the tools and the real-time platforms that we have are going to make it a lot easier, because I feel like gone are the days when you run a media campaign and 2 months later you find out how it did. It's almost like that's not even acceptable anymore. So I think all the tools and platforms available are going to help us with this as well. So anyway, I'm pretty excited about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We hit the time allotment that Mike gave us. I think we did a pretty good job on that, right, Mike? And
yeah, you did.
Thanks, ladies. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mindy. And thanks to the whole community driving this conversation forward. This is really, more, how are we going to be more fluid to be able to be reactive and proactive in 2021?